Hello and welcome or welcome back to the channel. My name is Judy and I love history, travel, and finding out how people and places tick. Today we're visiting Nimes, a lovely city in the south of France, sometimes referred to as the Rome of France because of its rich Roman heritage and remaining buildings. I think most tourists come to this area to see the famous Pont du Gard, and I did too, during my first visit a half a century ago when I was a flat-broke college student. This time, however, I decided to concentrate more on the downtown area. This is where I saw my first Roman watchtower, my first Roman wall, it was a pretty small chunk of masonry, my first arena or Colosseum, and my first Roman temple. I remember that even though my French was pretty terrible in those days, the people I talked to were not just polite, but kind and welcoming. I've been hooked ever since. Walk along with me and we'll explore how the city developed from its days as a Roman colony starting in the 1st century BCE and has maintained its relevance to this day. Roman Nimes grew up around a military settlement on a hill at the north side of the city. The Romans appropriated that hill from Celtic settlers and built a large watchtower along with some walls in this general area. The walls were eventually enlarged pretty significantly to include a much larger area, the local vicus or settlement. The Roman city wall was nearly 4 miles long and was built in the 1st century BCE. It had 14 gates and 80 towers and encircled the city. Today, the Two Millennia, or Big Tower, which we'll visit later in our tour, is about all that remains of that wall. I saw this diorama at the local history museum and photographed it back in 2015. I've been looking for an updated version of it ever since to show me what the Roman city area might have looked like. Big chunks of the diorama had yet to be filled in at that time, but it does show parts that are obvious and a tentative street map. I've marked it all for you on the image. One enormous contributor to Nimes' growth and prosperity was its location. The Via Domitia, the backbone of the empire's interstate highway system, was built through the middle of the city. Real estate agents will always tell you that location is everything, and this was just as true during the days of the Roman Empire as it is today. The roads were set up initially and mainly to make it easier for soldiers of empire to move about, getting to and from trouble and hotspots. But quite soon after an area was pacified, these roads became just as important to the empire for trading purposes. The roads and settlements are a chicken and egg proposition, meaning you have to ask yourself which one came first. Sometimes the road was put in and a settlement or way station was established to provide a place where draft animal teams could be swapped and travelers could take a break. Other times the road was actually routed near an existing settlement to serve the same purpose. That's what happened here. Nimes was an established Celtic stronghold long before the Romans arrived in 121 BCE. The road was built here starting just a few years later. This was far more than a way station on the Via Domitia. During the Augustan period, which ran from about 27 BCE, the year that this town became officially a colony, and 14 in the Christian era, Nimes was one of the most significant cities in Roman Gaul. The local people here became accommodating, more or less willingly, and the region was pleasant and experienced rapid growth and urban development. Roman engineers surveyed and chose those road routes very carefully, looking for the flattest, straightest route they could manage, something that they could build quickly and maintain fairly easily. Even today's builders haven't been able to top their picks. The highway you see here, marked with the red arrows, is French route D999. Even today's builders haven't been able to top their picks. The highway you see here follows on each side of the city the route of the Via Domitia. We can make a guess how it actually cut through the town originally. Not all Roman habitations began on unoccupied territory. Some of them began in the general area of a stronghold of the local inhabitants, and that is what happened here in Nimes. That stronghold was actually set up on top of a hill close to a vital year-round water source, and they appropriated it for their initial headquarters. They built a huge watchtower, we'll visit it later on our walk, and their first defensive walls here in the area. Roman city planning was based on a grid pattern, whether for the camps or the grandest of cities, and it always began with two main streets, the Decumanus Maximus, which generally ran east or west, and the Cardo Maximus, which generally ran north and south. As the area surrounding the military depot grew and more people moved into the neighborhood to provide services and trade with the military, sometimes those city walls were expanded along with the streets, and that happened here. The two streets met up at the site of the Forum, today landmarked by the Maison Carrée, once the main temple in the city. There are more clues about where the two main Roman roads must have run. The first and better known of these is called the Augustan Gate, on the eastern edge of the city. We already saw that the road east from here merges into French route D999, which itself ran over, or at least quite close, to the route of the Via Domitia. The best guess is that the road then worked its way along today's Rue Nationale with a couple of other streets, although the trail offers several possibilities leading to what must have been the Western Gate, beyond today's Garden of the Fountain, which we know was a sacred area in the imperial period. If there's a gate to be found at that end, I couldn't find any sign of it. The last time I checked there was no solid indication of anything except a taco joint. The north-south corridor turned out to be considerably more difficult for me to nail down. I know it must have entered the city from the north and terminated in the south, although I have to admit I haven't figured out and haven't been able to find a good map to show me where that happened. The best candidate for the North Gate is probably somewhere to the east of today's Two Millennia. There are some problems with this route, but possibly what is now called the Rue Auguste was part of the main road. Today that dead ends at the Maison Carrée. From there, heading south, there are a couple of candidates, but I think the most likely is somewhere near today's Boulevard Victor Hugo and near today's Rue de Port de France. The remains of an ancient gate can be found there to this day. The shadows of those initial hardy Roman legionaries continue to influence the city design today. This tourist map of modern Nimes gives you some idea of how the city's layout still corresponds with that set up by the legionaries and the new citizens of the colonial that this area became more than 2 millennia ago. Nimes was far more than just a simple way station on the Via Domitia. This was one of the most significant cities in Roman Gaul. It experienced rapid growth and urban development. That meant defensive walls, gates, and towers. There were interior roads laid out mostly on a grid street plan, a central meeting area called the Forum, which would have boasted temples, a law basilica, a market, administrative buildings, and likely a fountain for the water brought in from outside the city by aqueduct. These Roman-dominated habitations became, over time, little Romes, and the people here expected all the amenities that the empire normally would provide. In just less than a century, perhaps 3 generations, the city got its status upgrade to colonia. That meant the people who lived here were now citizens. Among other things, this also became a retirement colony for legionaries who had served out their enlistments, including veterans of Julius Caesar's 10th Equestrian Legion. The memory of those hardy veterans lives on in the city today in the form of the city shield, which features a palm tree and a crocodile commemorating the Legion's service in Africa. Our visit to Nimes begins as soon as you pop out of the back entrance to the train station and find yourself facing the Avenue Faucheur. The station and the street have been in operation since the late 1840s, and the street serves the same purpose today as it did then, to connect the train station to the rest of the city. It was named after an Englishwoman born Sophie Dawes, who with her youth, beauty, and intelligence managed to promote herself from English barmaid and possibly common prostitute to the mistress of one of the princes of France. You can read the rest of her story in my WordPress blog. The link is in the Learn More section of the description box below. By the time I arrived here in 1970, the area was already pretty shabby. It took until 2013, however, for this to become an urban renewal project designed to draw pedestrian traffic and present a pleasant, welcome, and safe area for arriving visitors to wander. At my second visit, it was much nicer than I remember from the bad old days. Today, the area comes complete with trees, benches, and a set of pools with fountains on one side. The French believe that banishing cars, putting in the fountains and trees will improve the air quality in the center of the city, as well as driving away the less desirable people who gather there mainly to prey on the tourists. I think they're probably right about this, but only if they manage to maintain those water pools and fountains. The park at the far end is named after Charles de Gaulle. Citizens and the politicians who represent their interests always have more than one way of dealing with the past. The easiest sometimes is to tear it all down and start over, although clearly that would have been a bad idea here in Nimes. Preserving the past tends to be much more expensive and pretty much automatically cuts into builder profits, which is one reason, in my opinion, why so many developers want to tear everything down. For 1,500 years and more, the Nimois said no to that notion. Then, in the 21st century, they came together and agreed that a new museum, designed to gather up and showcase all the artifacts scattered in other venues and to house anything newly discovered from the Roman period, was in order. Welcome to the Musée de la Romanité, the Gallo-Roman Museum of Nimes. It opened up in 2018 and is not without some controversy. 3 years earlier, when I took this photo, it was mostly just a big sign that didn't give a clue of what it was going to look like in front of a huge hole in the ground near the arena. One of the main challenges involved the museum's proximity to that Roman amphitheater, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Critics and local residents alike raised concerns about the impact and effect of the museum's modern design on the historical character of the surrounding neighborhood. Some feared that the museum's construction might even damage the building. I'll give the opponents this. The new museum will never, ever be confused for historical Nimes. The museum stands in stark contrast to everything else from the Roman period. I happen to think it probably is a good thing, but there is no arguing about taste. The artifacts displayed inside the museum come from a variety of sources, including some from the old Museum of Nimes, which we'll visit at the end of our walk. The building has at least 5,000 artifacts. One of the highlights is an exceptional mosaic dating from the beginning of the 3rd century AD, which was only discovered in 2006 when they were excavating on the Avenue Jean Jaurès. Now, about that controversy. It's about the facade. The sign blocking the view of the construction site that I saw didn't offer a clue about what the new building would look like on the outside. And I suspect as the building and its facade rose above that shield, everyone was completely puzzled. Early speculation was that it was supposed to represent some kind of Roman stylized toga, although to tell the truth, I can't see that at all. Another account says it's actually meant to suggest the bits and pieces of a Roman mosaic. I'm looking forward to spending a whole day here when I return. Among other things, the museum put in a rooftop restaurant with views of the arena. All museum restaurants tend toward being very pricey, and this one is no exception. However, you have to keep in mind you're paying for more than just the food and a glass of wine. You're paying rent for the table and the view. This neoclassical fountain stands in the center of the Charles de Gaulle Park at the northern end of the avenue. The fountain was part of the broader urban development plan that was aimed to modernize and beautify Nimes' public spaces when the avenue was built in the 19th century. The fountain features a central column adorned with intricate carvings and topped with a statue of a woman representing the city of Nimes. The base of the fountain is surrounded by 4 allegorical figures which represent the rivers that flow through the region. Her head is crowned with a model of the Maison Carrée, Nimes' famous square house, which we'll see in a few minutes. The Nimes Colosseum predates the one in Rome, and while it is somewhat smaller, it is far more remarkable in my opinion because so much of it has survived intact. For a while, after the Romans went away and the area fell back into brigandage, the local people bricked up all the exterior openings, using some of the stones from the tiered seats, and even built homes inside of this building. The interior is about 3/4 of the size of an American football field, so I imagine quite a few homes would have fit in here. The high walls almost as good as being inside a fortress. During the Roman period, the attendees came here apparently mostly for the gladiator fights. They reportedly were less keen on witnessing the execution of common criminals. Perhaps that didn't provide as good a show, which happened at noon, although they did like fights with animals, including bulls. Gladiators who fought here were highly skilled, well-paid, and as admired as modern athletes, and they led accordingly hard lives. Many died young. That part of the spectacle lives on in modern bullfights. The statue you see here is called Torero, a bronze sculpture near the Colosseum which honors the city's association with bullfighting, a tradition which came in first with the Romans and then was influenced by Spanish culture, and features a matador in full costume. A Spanish bullfighter named Christian Montcuquiol, who went by the name of Nimeño. He was a celebrated French matador who played a significant role in popularizing bullfighting here in France. Nimes had a successful career but suffered a tragic accident in 1989 during a bullfight quite close to here in the arena in Arles, which left him paralyzed. He took his own life in 1991. The statue is a tribute to his legacy and the bullfighting culture here in Nimes. Spanish bullfighting became popular in Nimes in the 19th centuries and still is practiced to this day. There's a non-violent version of the sport in which the bull survives, although the original version remains popular and is still legal despite protests from animal rights campaigners. The ancient attendees of these games were no lollygaggers in the comfort department and had some advantage not on offer to modern visitors. During the games, they benefit from a retractable canvas awning called a velarium. While the corridors were cool and pleasant, even in early May, the Provence sun really does beat down on you. This roof would have made the games far more pleasant to attend. This is the Maison Carrée, or square house. We saw a model of this building perched on the head of the Lady in the Pradier fountain at the beginning of our walk. The Maison Carrée was dedicated to Gaius and Lucius Caesar, the grandsons and adopted heirs of Roman Emperor Augustus, and went up around 16 BCE, after Nimes had achieved colony status, but while those two heirs were still alive. The temple was built as part of Augustus's effort to promote his dynasty, the Julio-Claudian family, and to solidify the imperial cult in the Roman provinces. The dedication of the temple to his heirs reinforced his legitimacy and the connection between Rome and Nimes, which was a key Roman colony at the time. The temple was built out of local limestone, probably quarried somewhere near Pont du Gard, and put together without mortar. It most likely was covered with stucco originally to make it look a bit more polished and may even have been painted. The temple was converted to a Christian church in the 4th century and served various other functions afterwards, including town hall, a private residence, and a museum, which is how it survived. The origin of Nimes dates back to the 6th century BCE, when a Celtic tribe settled around a fountain that they deified, consecrating a sanctuary. History suggests that by the time the Roman legionaries arrived, as many as 5,000 to 10,000 Celts might have lived here. You can learn more about them in the Learn More section below. Roman legionaries used the area for the same purpose, setting up a temple complex dedicated to the worship of the cult of Augustus. The gardens you see here came much later. They were built in the 18th century and were one of the first public gardens in Europe, built near the fountain area, which is how they got their name. This is a very popular green space and quite pleasant to visit. The shady underpass you see here is called the Passage Under the Rocks. It may look real, but it is actually a man-made structure. It's an artificial passage located right here in the gardens, near to the so-called Temple of Diana, which we'll visit in a few minutes. The passage was built to create a scenic route through the gardens, blending with the rocky landscape already there to give the impression of a natural cave. It's actually quite new. It was created in 1975. The sculpture is made from concrete and other materials, but it is designed to interact and blend with the landscape around it. This Roman-era site is labeled as the Temple of Diana. The marker also mentions that at least some experts think it probably was a library. There's no foundation that I can find out for its attribution to the goddess of the hunt. This is the best name we have for it, and it's on Google Maps to this day. Experts are still debating exactly what it must have been, but its location near the sacred spring does give us a couple of clues. The building is often associated with the Augusteum, a sanctuary here dedicated to the imperial cult of the Emperor Augustus. While it may have been part of the same religious complex, it probably was not the main temple, but rather some kind of auxiliary building. And there is a possibility it did serve as a library, a meeting hall, or a sanctuary. Its architecture, including vaulted ceilings and side niches, suggests that it had some other function than a traditional temple. The structure was later repurposed in the Middle Ages as part of a monastery, contributing to its preservation, and I suspect that is how the notion that it may have been a library in antiquity arose. Inside, there are niches with pediments that suggest a place to store written scrolls. We learned at the beginning of our walk that Celtic settlers in this area set up shop in and around a sacred spring and built a fortified camp or retreat on the highest ground in the area, today referred to as Mount Cavalier. When the Romans arrived, they appropriated that hill and set up their fortified camp, complete with walls and a watchtower. This is a Tour Magna, or Big Tower, which was set up by the Romans in the 1st century BCE as part of the city's defensive system. Over time, the tower underwent modifications and changes, especially during the medieval period, when parts of it were repurposed, and some of the original Roman stones were used for other construction projects. The use of the tower as a fortification or watchtower meant that it was also subject to practical changes that may have weakened or altered its structure. By the 18th century, much of the original Roman building was lost or altered, and parts of it were in danger of collapsing. The stonework had deteriorated, and the tower was left in a ruinous state. However, restoration efforts began in the 19th and 20th centuries. Today, there's a small display area at the base, and if your knees are strong enough, and mine were twice, you can climb to the top, where there's a grand view of the modern city. This short waterway is the Nimes Canal. It was originally built in the 17th century to bring water from the Rhone River to the city of Nimes and surrounding areas, particularly for agricultural purposes. Today it's no longer used for that purpose, but it's still important for local water management. The canal is supposed to help regulate water flow and contribute to the aesthetic beauty of the gardens that we visited earlier. The waterway also is supposed to prevent flooding and manage water distribution. Unfortunately, in 1988, it failed in that task. That year, Nimes suffered one of the most devastating natural disasters in the city's history. A severe Mediterranean storm brought over 16 inches of rain to the city in just a few hours. The city's drainage system and canals were overwhelmed, and at least 10 people died, along with hundreds being injured. Thousands of homes and businesses suffered severe damage as well. The disaster has led to urban planning changes designed to improve flood defenses. This small plaque commemorates the date of the flood and the lives lost to it. This is the Castellum, the hub of Roman Nimes water supply system. The Latin word means something like little fortress, but is commonly used when they're talking about Roman water supply infrastructure. Construction here dates back to the 1st century, probably as a growing local population outgrew the water available from various springs and wells. The Castellum was essentially a circular basin, a little less than 20 feet in diameter, and this photograph really doesn't do it justice, where water from the aqueduct was collected and then distributed through a network of underground pipes to various parts of the city. The entire system relied, as did the aqueduct, on gravity to help move water downhill and through the city. The water source here was a natural spring, located only about 12 miles north of the city, but the aqueduct to transport it here from the spring ran 30 miles or a bit more. The spring water was channeled into the aqueduct, which followed that winding path due to the region's hilly terrain. The Castellum, like the aqueduct, was abandoned in late antiquity, probably during the 4th to 6th century CE. The Romans built sturdy bits of architecture meant to stand with limited maintenance, but not no maintenance. Keeping up the 31-mile-long structure would have been a time-consuming and expensive proposition. You may recall that some of the buildings we've already seen here were built from limestone quarried in the area around the spring. Limestone says to me that the Romans and their successors were dealing with hard water. Hard water builds up in the pipes in the form of scale. As the Western Roman Empire weakened in the 4th and 5th centuries, urban infrastructure all over suffered. Cities like Nimes experienced a pretty serious economic and population decline, meaning they actually didn't need that much water. They no longer could count on the aqueduct, so they began using wells, local springs, and rainwater. By the medieval period, the aqueduct was in ruins, with sections repurposed for building materials. The same thing happened here. The Cathedral of Our Lady and St. Castor is usually just called Nimes Cathedral. The cathedral is dedicated to the Virgin Mary and St. Castor of Apt, a town located here in the south of France. Castor was also the patron saint of Nimes. Castor is also the patron saint of monks, hermits, and those who choose to follow a contemplative spiritual life. But Castor had a business side to his character. Once upon a time, he was a lawyer or a magistrate, and he's sometimes considered the protector of judges, scholars, and those seeking justice. The cathedral site was part of the Roman-era Forum, although there's ongoing argument as to what it might have been in those days. Most scholars believe this was the site of an earlier Roman temple, probably dedicated to Augustus, the first emperor. That building was either converted or replaced by an early Christian church. The current structure dates largely from the 11th and 12th centuries, as does what I think may be the most interesting detail, a frieze depicting scenes from the book of Genesis. I decided to end our tour here with a stop at the Museum of Old Nimes. This is a general history museum. It was built into a beautiful 17th century former bishop's palace located next to the cathedral we just visited. There's a beautiful courtyard and garden as well. The museum focuses on everyday life in Nimes over the centuries. Until the opening of the Gallo-Roman Museum, it also held most of the local Roman-era artifacts, although I think most of those have now been shifted to that other museum. Part of the museum was set up to resemble a voyage or a safari, seeing different animals at each stop. Visitors are welcomed to the museum by Maurice, a stuffed male giraffe from Niger, followed by a Siberian tiger, a Canadian elk, and even a polar bear, showing the diversity of the living world. When the Roman Museum was being developed, there was talk of shutting this museum down completely, although that has now, fortunately, changed into a modernization effort. The plan is to attract people who are interested in the city's history and culture both before and after the Roman era. One important part of the collection is a project that was already underway decades ago. This is where you can learn virtually everything there is to know about the fabric going into modern blue jeans. Denim is a durable and versatile fabric that has become a staple in fashion and workwear worldwide. It originated here. The name comes from the French name serge de Nîmes, which means serge, which is a sturdy twill fabric from Nîmes. The fabric originated here in the 17th century and became widely known for its durability, making it ideal for hard-working garments like trousers and work pants. The fabric made it to California in the late 1870s in time for the American Gold Rush. Jacob Davis and Levi Strauss tailored it into the first blue jeans for the miners. They used rivets to reinforce the points of stress. By the mid-20th century, jeans had become popular as casual wear, particularly in American culture. They symbolized rebellion in the 1950s thanks to icons like James Dean and Marlon Brando. Perhaps they still do. Come back next time for another adventure with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide. Thank you for traveling with me today. This year, we'll be making a grand tour of France. Not just the famous cities, although we'll hit them too, but some lesser-known gems. The basis of all my French posts is my personal on-the-ground visits, extending over a period of more than half a century. I took a lot of pictures, I asked a lot of questions, and I tried to write down the answers. Things change, even in a puny human lifetime, and most French cities are considerably older than I am, so a great deal of research goes into each one of these presentations. Most of that work never makes it into the videos except as an incidental reference or a mention. You might wonder what happens to the rest of it. Well, I write it down, and sometimes, if it seems interesting enough, and I admit that is a matter of taste, I write it up and post it separately. If you want to know more, check the description box below. I'll put in links from time to time for more information. Sometimes this will be information I dug up, other times it'll be links to what I hope are honest, reputable sources. In addition, I have a travel blog, a health and wellness blog, because travel is easier if we're healthy, and can be found on Blue Sky and Facebook. The addresses are all to the side of this video. Finally, I have a favor to ask. If you enjoyed my post, please like, subscribe, and share. This will help my channel grow. Thank you, and keep on traveling.